Good morning. I join others in welcoming those of you who are participating in person here on High Ridge Road and those of you who are participating online. We're so grateful to have you with us this morning. The sermons and services of the Stanford Church are archived on their Facebook page. We hope that you'll make use of those. We hope that you'll share those with others. There are other opportunities for spiritual growth and ministry, and you can find those on the webpage of the Stanford Church. And if this church can assist you in any way, you can reach the elders and the staff through the links that are on that front page of the webpage of the Stanford Church. Again, we're so glad to have you here. We live with limits. And Sarah lives with a limit of flying. Sarah lives in North Mississippi, just across the state line from Memphis, Tennessee, where my wife Kendra and I live. Sarah has grown children who live throughout the southeastern and southwestern United States. And she was recently telling me about one of her children who played baseball. Those baseball games would take that child everywhere, and Sarah and her husband tried to attend all the games they could, even those that were far away from northern Mississippi. Oh, I asked her, did you have to fly to those baseball games? No, she said solemnly. I do not fly. Oh, I thought curiously, well, have you ever flown? And Sarah proceeded to tell me the first and last time that she had ever flown. She was flying with her older brother and mother. They made their way to the gate. They boarded the airplane. The aircraft taxied to the runway and took off. And shortly after takeoff, they encountered some turbulence. And her mother, with a weak stomach, grabbed a sack from the seat back in front of her, put it up to her mouth, closed her eyes, and began to moan loudly. And little Sarah, having never seen anything like this before, turned to her older brother for information and consolation. "What's happening?" Sarah asked her older brother. "What's wrong with Mom?" Sarah asked her older brother. And in older brother fashion, without a blink, the older brother responded by saying, "Mom's dying." And before Sarah could even process that claim, the older brother followed up with, "And you're next." And poor Sarah sat paralyzed in fear for the rest of the flight. It was her first and last flight. We live with limits. And our text this morning that comes from the Sermon on the Mount allows us to explore some of these limits. In this text, Jesus reveals that we don't just have limits when it comes to mundane things like flying. We also have limits when it comes to the most meaningful thing of all, loving. There are people, Jesus says, who we simply do not love. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 43, Jesus says, "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.'" This is the sixth time in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus has said something like, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." And in each of these six instances, Jesus is pointing out a way that religious people have misinterpreted or misapplied a text in what we call the Old Testament, what might be known as the Hebrew Bible. And in this case, Jesus is pointing to a text in the Hebrew Bible found in Leviticus chapter 19. "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Later in his ministry, Jesus is going to show us that this command to love neighbor is the second greatest command. Jewish scholars counted 613 commandments from Genesis through Deuteronomy, the portion of the Hebrew Bible they called the Torah. A Brooklyn-born artist named Archie Rand once painted one painting for each of those 613 commandments. That is a lot of painting, and that is a lot of commands. And later in his ministry, Jesus is going to tell us that this command to love your neighbor as you love yourself is the second greatest command in those 613 commandments. But the problem was that by Jesus' day, this command had been misinterpreted and misapplied, so that it was understood in the way that Jesus responds in this Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. That is, by this time, the word neighbor had been so narrowed, so restricted, that it primarily only referred to someone who was good. Anyone who's good, that's your neighbor. Anyone who's good, that's the person that you're supposed to love. And everyone else, well, you're free to hate them. Think about the cast of characters in this text. Jesus lists the following: neighbor, the good, the just, those who love you, and your brothers. Those are the people that you're supposed to love. Those are the ones who are your neighbor. And then there are others listed in this text. Enemies, those who persecute you, the evil, the unjust, tax collectors, Gentiles, both of whom are considered to be profane and ungodly. Those people stand far outside the scope of our love. We're free to hate them. And so this text and the circumstance that prompts it provide us an opportunity to explore this truth. We practice a limited love. There are people who easily fall within the limits of our love, and there are people who sit far outside the limits of our love. We practice a limited love. And we might consider 4 ways in which that manifests itself in our lives today. First, there are some people who stand outside the limits of our love because simply we hate them. Maybe there are people who've done very hurtful things to us, and in response we hate them and we push them outside the limits of our love. Miroslav Volf is a Croatian Protestant theologian and the director for the Center for Faith and Culture at Yale. He writes about how during the Croatian War, he was terribly mistreated by a man he simply calls Captain G. Captain G targeted Miroslav Volf because of his ethnicity. Volf writes this: "To triumph fully, evil needs 2 victories, not 1. The first victory happens when an evil deed is perpetuated. The second victory when evil is returned. After the first victory, evil would die if the second victory did not infuse it with new life." Volf talks about how he hated Captain G, but he came to realize that his hatred only fueled the evil that had wounded him in the first place. And perhaps some of you find yourself in that same situation. There are people who have done hurtful things to you, and in response you hate them. You push them far outside the scope of your love. But as a result, you're only fueling the evil that hurt you in the first place. Second, there are people who are far outside the limits of our love because of the way that we dehumanize them. Dehumanization refers to the way that we talk about or talk to people or groups of people in ways that treat them as if they were less than human. David Livingston Smith, a professor at the University of New England, has written a book called Less Than Human. He writes this: "Dehumanization is the belief that some beings only appear human, but beneath the surface where it really counts, they aren't human at all." And he traces this through various cultures. Nazis called Jews disease-carrying rodents. Hutus involved in the Rwandan genocide called Tutsis cockroaches. The indigenous people in this country were often referred to as savages. Serbs labeled Bosnians aliens. Slave owners in this country referred to those they enslaved as animals. Dehumanization is our tendency to talk about and treat people or groups of people as if they were less than human. And this feels especially important for us to note during this season of increased polarization in our country, on the eve of a national election in our country. all throughout social classes in this country. There are so many people who use labels and words to refer to other people or groups of people in ways that dehumanize them. And as we do that, we are pushing them outside the limits of our love. Third, there are some people who stand outside the limits of our love because of our contempt for them. Again, this feels especially important on the eve of a national election. Arthur Brooks proposes that contempt is the central problem in our country when it comes to political discourse. Brooks writes, "We don't have an anger problem in American politics. We have a contempt problem." If you listen to how people talk to each other in political life today, you notice, he says, it is with pure contempt. And he defines contempt as anger mixed with disgust. What he calls the unsullied conviction of the worthlessness of others. Too often this is happening, especially in social media. As we engage people who live or look differently than we do, who behave differently than we do, who believe differently than we do, so often we treat others with contempt. And in so doing, we're pushing them outside the limits of our love. And then fourth, there are people who stand outside the limits of our love because of our indifference toward them. Elie Wiesel was a Romanian-born writer, a Nobel laureate, a survivor of the Holocaust. He writes this, "I think the greatest source of infinite danger in the world, to the world, is indifference. I've always believed that the opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, but indifference. The opposite of life is not death, but indifference to life and death. Indifference," he says, "is the enemy." And so I invite you to take a moment right now to consider yourself. Who in this season of your life stands inside the limits of your love? Who in this season of your life stands outside the limits of your love? The reality is that we practice a limited love. But Jesus calls us to pursue a limitless love. He urges us to push those boundaries out so that all who were once excluded are now included. Matthew chapter 5, verse 44 and following, Jesus says, "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same?" Those that we might hate, we're now called to love. As we live with and linger with Jesus, our love loses its limits. Now, it's still granted to those who are good, those who are just, those who love us, those who are our brothers. But now it's extended beyond that to now include those who are our enemies, those who persecute us, the evil, the unjust, the tax collectors, the Gentiles. What Jesus is doing in this text is similar to what he does later in his ministry. A religious expert comes to test Jesus about this second greatest commandment. And the religious expert says, "Well, who is my neighbor after all?" And Jesus responds by telling a story in which the hero is not considered to be a good person. And it was Jesus' way of saying that every single living person on this planet is your neighbor. And therefore, every single living person on this planet is worthy of your limitless love. Bob Goff, in his book, Everybody Always, writes this: "Each of us is surrounded every day by our neighbors. They're ahead of us, behind us, on each side of us. They're every place we go. They're sacking groceries and attending city council meetings. They're holding cardboard signs on street corners and raking leaves next door. They play high school football and deliver the mail. They're heroes and hookers and pastors and pilots. They live on the streets and design our bridges. They go to seminaries and they live in prisons. They govern us and they bother us. They're everywhere we look. It's one thing we all have in common. We're all somebody's neighbor, and they're ours. This has been God's simple yet brilliant master plan from the beginning. He made a whole world of neighbors. We call it Earth, but God just calls it a really big neighborhood. Jesus calls us to pursue a limitless love. No more hatred. No more dehumanization. No more contempt. No more indifference. Just simply, purely, limitless love. And then Jesus provides two motives for pursuing this limitless love. The first one is this: the Father is defined by limitless love. Verse 45 of chapter 5, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. Jesus is referring here to what some people call God's common grace. God's gracious love is given indiscriminately. His renewing rain, his warm sun, is not just given to us or people who are like us. His renewing rain, his warm sun, is given to Republicans and to Democrats, to people who are white and to people of color, to the rich and to the poor, to those who live in big cities and those who live in small villages, to those who are heterosexual and those who are not. His love, Jesus says, even extends to us when our own love is limited. And we are, Jesus says, children of that Father. And therefore, like our Father, we are called to practice an indiscriminate form of love. And the second motive Jesus provides for pursuing this limitless love is this: maturity is defined by limitless love. Verse 48, you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. The word perfect here means mature. Jesus is closing up this portion of the Sermon on the Mount by exploring what it means to be mature, what it means to be grown up, to be a mature Christian, to be a mature church. We can't just look at the soundness of our sermons. We can't just look at the fullness of our facilities. To be a mature Christian, to be a mature church, we have to look at the limitlessness of our love. Maturity is defined by love. The greater the love, the greater the maturity. Tommy is a friend of mine here in Memphis. He once told me the story about his dad. Tommy's dad moved to Liberia, and he brought with him two things: a bag and a book. The bag was filled with medical supplies to heal bodies. The book, his Bible, was filled with stories to heal souls. But once he got to Liberia, he found that a local medicine man distrusted him. This medicine man viewed Tommy's dad as an outsider, as someone who had only come to destroy their way of life. But then there was a cholera outbreak and everything changed. And so one day the medicine man approached Tommy's dad and said through an interpreter, "Come, bring your bag, leave your book." And so Tommy's dad came and brought his bag and used his medical supplies to bring healing to people whose bodies were suffering from cholera. And then he returned to his village. Not long after that, the medicine man approached Tommy's dad again and said through an interpreter, "Come, bring your bag, but leave your book." And so Tommy's dad came, once again risking infection to himself, and used those medical supplies to bring healing to people who lived and looked very differently than he did. And then he returned to his village. A third time, the medicine man came to him and said through the interpreter, "Come, leave your bag and bring your book. Because this time, everyone in all of the villages wanted to know what had prompted Tommy's dad to risk his own health to bring healing to people who lived and looked differently than he did. And of course, the answer was there in his book. The answer is Jesus Christ, the one who loves his neighbors and the one who teaches us to do the same. I want to invite you to look for a slide in the next few days on my social media accounts. This slide will provide you some additional spiritual practices that you can engage in this week so that you might put this teaching from Jesus into practice. Let's not just listen to this teaching about loving large. Let's put it into practice every day of our lives this week. May the Lord watch over you and keep you this week.